Thank you. I'm unmuted, yes. Right. Thank you very much indeed. There are two difficult acts to follow, I must say, from both David and, well, from three acts actually, Mario, David and Teresa. I thoroughly enjoyed them and learned a lot myself. I've been given the task of, in our celebration for the English version of A Theology of Liberation by the Dominican priest, as he is now, Gustavo Gutierrez, and I've been asked to reflect on the relevance of liberation theology to Scotland. I just want to say, to start off with, that it's a propitious time to do so. As we heard just in the past week from the mouth of the leader of one of the most powerful countries in the world, that Ukraine should not even exist as an independent state. Gustavo reminds us that the main challenge of the world comes not from non-believers, but from those human beings who regard others as non-humans, the human being who is not recognized as such by the prevailing social order. Though my brief is to suggest the relevance of liberation theology to Scotland today, let's also have in mind the Calvary of the Ukrainian people today and in the coming weeks. Through prayer and through action born of gospel-based contemplation, which liberation theology encourages us to regard as a starting point for actions of love. When I started working on this, after Mary asked me to do this, and of course I always say yes to Mary Cullen, I discovered, of course, it was in fact a huge project. So I'm going to take a leaf out of the book of the great Brazilian liberation theologian Leonardo Boff, who wrote, "The core of liberation theology is the empowerment of the poor to end poverty and achieve the freedom to live a good life." The liberation in liberation theology covers liberation of the human person, political and social liberation, and liberation from sin, which highlights, of course, social sin. With therefore two essential elements in our search for how liberation theology could be relevant in helping achieve the ending of dehumanizing poverty in Scotland, which too many of our people have suffered over the generations. And secondly, in living a fulfilled and good life, rather than seeing life through the prism of a whiskey glass, or of a needle to inject drugs, or of fanatical fandom of a football team. Both getting rid of poverty and promoting the good life are, of course, intimately connected. But as a bishop once said to me, well, why are you interested in theology? Forget theology. It's just about doing good things for people, and especially the poor. But it has got something to do with theology. So what is it? The American theologian David Tracy regards theology as, quote, a discipline that attempts to correlate the meaning and truth of the Christian faith with the meaning and truth of our contemporary experience. There is a link, in other words, between preaching and shedding light on what we should do about poverty. Gustavo goes even further. He says in his Theology of Liberation that it is a theology which does not stop with reflecting on the world, but rather tries to be part of the process through which the world is transformed. It's a theology which is open to the gift of the kingdom of God in the protest against the plunder of the vast majority of people, in liberating love, and in the building of a new, just and fraternal society. Our task following this theology is, in Paulo Freire's phrase, to be transformers of the world. The Scottish Presbyterian political theologian, my mentor and friend of many who are watching here from Scotland today, I'm referring, of course, to the late Duncan Forrester. Duncan wrote that it was for Christians and the church, quote, to show, not just to say, whose side they're on. He called for practical acts of solidarity, which involve opposition to the economic, social, political, and cultural forces of dehumanization, as well as the religious legitimizations of these forces. So theology has an important and crucial role to play in squeezing ethics into political discourse here in Scotland. So you know where I'm coming from. I want to highlight a governmental act of the very opposite of solidarity with the poor, which broke families and lives in my hometown. When I was much younger, the Edward Heath government, one of the many British governments formed by the Conservative and Unionist Party, rejected by the Scottish people in the post-war era, closed the main shipyard in Clydebank, where I was brought up. I usually describe it as a little fishing village, but Scots know better. It's, shall we say, a deindustrialized town and was mainly a shipbuilding town. The closure was in 1971, and that devastated the lives of thousands of families and robbed them of the hope of a job, a decent living, and a future in their own country. And one very important image from my childhood is seeing outside the shipyard gates two billboards being put up. One said, "Emigrate to Australia," and the other said, "Join the British Army," which meant in those days being sent to Northern Ireland during the Troubles from a town which was viscerally divided between orange and green. My uncle and aunt, with their 5 children, took the advice to emigrate and went to a shipyard town in California. Other Bankies, as locals are called, followed the advice of the other billboard and joined the British Army with their deeply ingrained sectarian prejudices intact. One youngster who joined the British regiment was dragged through the streets of Belfast by a fast IRA car after he'd shot a Catholic. There wasn't much left of him to bury. Those posters, the inhumanity and ignorance of the UK government, and the consequences of a government we Scots had not voted for, closing one of the few big employment opportunities in town and treating people as non-humans, marked me forever. So what does liberation theology teach us about ending poverty? Well, according to the Boff brothers, Leonardo and Clodovis, in their book Introducing Liberation Theology and the Liberation and Theology series of the 80s, liberation theology is done within direct knowledge of the reality of oppression and liberation through objective engagement and solidarity with the poor. They talk of 3 mediations: socio-analytical mediation, operating in the world of the oppressed, that is, doing a social analysis, linking faith with justice; a hermeneutical mediation, operating in the sphere of God's plan for the poor in the world, that is, reading the Bible and seeing what the church thinks of this; and practical mediation, meaning discerning the type of action that will result in overcoming oppression. I'll begin with a very quick social analysis of Scotland, and then through the words of the most powerful living liberation theologian, namely Pope Francis, illustrate the relevance of liberation theology to our wee patch of ground as we learn what we must do to end poverty and ultimately to try to imagine better lives for everyone who lives in Scotland. And I take stock of what Ruth Lister, the former director of the Child Poverty Action Group and now, rather sadly, a peer of the realm, wrote in her book, Poverty, she said, "Poverty is a material reality, disfigures and constrains the lives of millions of women, men, and children, and its persistence diminishes those among the non-poor who acquiesce in or help sustain it." So let's look at a social analysis of Scottish poverty. And I'm going to cite a report done by someone from the United Nations rather than use Scottish sources in case they should be thought of as being biased. In November 2018, Professor Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, issued a statement after his visit to the UK. He pointed out that the UK was the 5th biggest global economy, with all the possible advantages that brings. Yet he concluded, "It thus seems patently unjust and contrary to British values that so many people are living in poverty." In language which people are using again in 2022, he mentions interviews where people had to choose between eating and heating, and how food banks had gone from 29 at the height of the financial crisis to 2,000 in the UK as a whole. The Scottish Government, Professor Alston says, along with those governments in Wales and Northern Ireland, continues to provide access to welfare funds for emergency hardships and has tried to avoid the worst aspects of austerity to the extent of spending £125 million a year on mitigation. From a budget, however, which is decided by Westminster and by a party which has not been voted in by the Scottish people since 1955. A few other little statistics from the National Records of Scotland. They say that the population will fall by 1.8% by 2045, that people over 65 are projected to grow by 1/3 by mid-2045, a very serious aging problem, which only migration could solve, but we're not allowed to exceed Westminster's numbers. Around 1 in 4 children live in poverty, and the poor are 18 times more likely to die of drug use. Not a pretty picture. So what in 2022 can liberation theology lead us to do? And here I want to look at the liberation theology of Pope Francis and joining his thoughts up with a Scottish activist against poverty, Duncan Maclaren. Argentinian theologians didn't adopt liberation theology with the enthusiasm of those in El Salvador or Brazil, the people that David would meet in Central America. But they promoted the theology of the people, which was less political and celebrated popular piety as the religion of the people. And in this way, they connected up to the poor. But Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who came out of that tradition, has maybe undergone a Romero moment of conversion in the Vatican, I have to say, having been there 12 years, of all places, especially if you read Evangelio Gaudium, where he calls free market ideology a tyranny, describes neoliberalism as the economy which kills, and talks about a deified market in a system which tends to devour everything which stands in the way of increased profits. Pope Francis says in the preface to a new book on his social teaching that Jesus, quote, is asking our faith to emerge from the stasis of an individual religiosity or from its reduction to legalism to become a faith that calls us each to cooperate in the work of God in different situations of life and society. Pope Francis says we must never neutralize this social dimension of the Christian faith, since the kerygma or proclamation of the faith itself has a social dimension, meaning that the life of society will be a locus for dignity, universal fraternity, justice, and peace. And Pope Francis is emphasizing that each person is part of a community in the human family, regardless of race or creed. That the human person should not be exploited by economic or political forces, that the gap between the rich and the poor has to be narrowed, and that all dimensions of life have to be integrated into a whole which works for the common good. He reminds us of the poorest who are cast off by society, forced to live off what is discarded, and suffer unjustly from the abuse of the environment. They are, he says, part of today's widespread and quietly growing culture of waste. So how does this apply to Scotland? One of the most powerful accounts of what it's like to be poor here in Glasgow, at least, is Poverty Safari by Darren McGarvey. He's now a TV commentator and is also a rapper known as Lockie, which apparently is the Nordic name for a trickster god. He was born in a poor and violent part of Glasgow and was a self-confessed alcoholic before turning his life around. He talks of being part of an underclass who were invisible and therefore were suspicious of strangers in their area, as well as the authorities such as the police. They were reluctant to vote because people in power didn't care about them. That influenced their worldview. McGarvey writes, reading and all forms of academic achievement were regarded by many of my male peers as either feminine or the preserve of posh people and freaks. Not grassing when the police were involved in the community about a misdemeanor for many young men he knew was what constituted their moral compass. And of course, they had no agency over their own lives. And when they went to the brew, the employment exchange, they were mainly treated as vermin. And the way they spoke in the Glaswegian dialect, of course, would just underline that. I remember growing up myself when my grandmother, who came from the northeast of Scotland and spoke the Doric language, that she, and I use the word I, meaning yes, and she said, no, if you use Scots, that means poverty. You have to say yes. And then when I was doing some work for the Gaelic Books Council in the Outer Isles, I knocked on the door trying to sell Gaelic books. And the person who opened this particular door said, I want to know nothing about the Gaelic language. Gaelic for us means poverty on the island of Scalpay. So language becomes an important part of the destruction of our culture. Pope Francis stresses, as did the original liberationists, having imbibed the teaching of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educationalist, the importance of poor people escaping extreme poverty through participation in all levels of society and having that agency over their own lives that Darren McGarvey's mates didn't have. The Pope says that the poor must be allowed, quote, to be dignified agents of their own destiny. For McGarvey, dignity was for fancy people, as he writes. Despite this, he says that in the lead up to the establishment of what was called Pollock Free State from 1994 to 1996 as a protest against the building of the M77 motorway through some green space in Pollock, his district, political consciousness rose substantially. Not because of money, because that didn't materialize, but because people were beginning to take responsibility for their own community. And there are some people on on the web today who know a lot more about that and were more active than I was in that struggle. And I hope that they will comment on that in the chat. In the past, things were done to the community, not for the community or with the community. Nowadays, the Scottish Government encourages and facilitates community buyouts of some of our islands, such as Egg and Gia, where the community are in charge of the islands. And to show you the difference between tourist authorities or landowners compared to locals being in charge, when I was in Gia last year, there was someone from the community to welcome people coming off the ferry. I had a sore foot and was even offered a lift to the Achamore Gardens about a mile away. There's a big difference between landowners chasing you away and a community welcoming you to their island, to their homes. McGarvey has harsh words for charities and NGOs, which he says often behave like an imperial power, where, quote, poorer communities are viewed as primitive cultures that need to be modernized, retooled, and upskilled. And the people engaged in this don't think the people of the community have any ideas of their own, and so they superimpose their own values onto the community. Pope Francis says something different in Evangelio Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, where he connects Jesus' command to his disciples that they themselves should give the poor something to eat in St. Mark's Gospel, with both a political and a human act for modern Christians. The political act is for the Christian to work to rid the world of the structural causes of poverty, and the human act is to promote what he calls the integral development of the poor, by showing small acts of kindness and solidarity with the poor who have ordinary needs on a daily basis. In my experience of the aid and development sector, this often mirrors the practices of some aid agencies, which promote the white savior model and often create dependence in a poor community for food or material goods, rather than promote autonomy while treating the people as if they were children. As Christians, we are all encouraged to be in solidarity with the poor. Often this means giving money only, or even worse, adopting a child as if that person was a commodity in a supermarket. Pope Francis provides his own definition of solidarity as being the creation of a new mindset which thinks in terms of community and the priority of the life of all over the appropriation of goods by the few. McGarvey quotes a youth worker from the Gorbals, stressing that improving self-esteem, and not simply employability, is key to cultivating the kind of self-belief and resilience which eludes so many young people. Kindness is key. Pope Francis says in Fratelli Tutti, published in 2020, precisely because it entails esteem and respect for others, once kindness becomes a culture within society, it transforms lifestyles, relationships, and the ways ideas are discussed and compared. And this leads to a culture of encounter between two human beings. It also leads to a just organizing of society. The Pope says it's an equally indispensable act of love to strive to organize and structure society so that one's neighbor will not find him or herself in poverty. It's an act of charity to assist someone suffering, but it's also an act of charity to work to change the social conditions that cause his or her suffering in the first place. McGarvey says something similar from his time working in a prison, where just as someone could slash you over possession of a slice of toast, the polarity of somebody's day could be reversed by the simple exchange of a kindness. Pope Francis puts forward his fundamental vision that the spiritual stature of a person's life must be measured by love. That love must extend beyond family and friends to encompass the whole world, and especially those who suffer most of it. We must cultivate a social friendship where the God-given dignity of every person is acknowledged. And McGarvey too touches on the need for radical change, but insists that the new frontier for individuals and movements who want to radically change society is to first recognize the need for radical change within ourselves. The Pope calls for the recovery of kindness, which is an antidote to indifference. And I have the feeling that the agnostic Darren McGarvey would agree with them. Let's say a few words about the good life. And to give you an idea what it looks like when you change. I used to help out in a halfway house for drug users in Glasgow, usually coming out of prison on their way to a rehab centre. And I'll contrast two youngsters I met then. One was a 17-year-old who'd been the mass server at a church in a deprived area of Glasgow. He had to interrupt our conversations all the time by going to the toilet to vomit because his body craved drugs. And I remember him coming back to me in the living room and saying, "I don't think I'm going to make it." And although I said the opposite, I knew he was right. In contrast, another resident who came from the same area as the centre said her whole family were on drugs and that she had a boyfriend who would stay with her if she remained clean. She had the motivation of being in love, and I'm sure she did make it. She had a vision of the good life. Liberation theology calls for the poor themselves to participate fully in the decisions which form their lives. Having spent a good many years traveling the world, especially in the global south, I'm going to move from Scotland slightly to make a point to Cambodia. I'm going to Cambodia. I was there to examine an integral human development program run by Caritas Australia. I used to live in Australia after Rome. And I found that an extremely poor community of the discarded, as Pope Francis would say, had turned their lives around because of a kind of training training for transformation program, which came directly out of liberation theology. For them, life blossomed materially, but also lives were transformed by the increase in self-confidence and a renewed respect from their more prosperous peers in the micro-society in which they lived. As relationships changed for the better, the common good was established by an increased empathy for those who were previously shunned, such as the disabled and those living with HIV. They were brought into society as decision makers and bearers of hope for a more fulfilled life, an action which is also a demonstration of lived solidarity. When this kind of change happens, a selfish individualism is abandoned in favor of an organized community who work out their decisions together, make appropriate choices according to the common good principle, and put them into practice. In the case of rural Cambodia, through democratically elected self-help groups, which will guarantee some sustainability, which, by the way, challenge patriarchy, as women were elected to chair some of the groups. Out of that change of culture emerges the good life. The community, the journey of this community went from being ashamed of their poverty, which led to them feeling like passive objects, to being subjects of their own future and confident in their new lifestyle, their new place in their society, and the new feeling of self-esteem that swept over them and gave them hope. This is a model for communities in Scotland. And I realise I've steered a wee bit further away from Scotland, but I'll end there. In conclusion, this is my liberationist vision of Scotland, so that systemic poverty can be far more seriously tackled and a good life for all be offered. But there is something else, the importance of Scotland having the freedom to be herself. I want to take one example of how we are hampered from making our society better for others in the current constitutional setup. Scotland has the highest death numbers from drug overdoses in Western Europe. Yet the Scottish Parliament, the Glasgow Council, and even the Residential Community Council, of which I was part, and where the centre I'm going to talk about was going to be placed, we all voted for setting up drug consumption rooms where people could take their drugs in safety with medical supervision. They met also with lawyers and social workers who could try to sort their lives out. It had worked in other countries, but this was a reserved issue, that is, reserved to the Westminster government, which said no. And so the deaths and the lack of innovation continue. And this is only one sample of one piece of liberation can be undermined by the current constitutional arrangement. So in my view, and this is, I know, being very controversial, independence is the chance to rid Scotland and a bit of the world of dehumanising poverty while doing our bit to save the planet. Increasingly in the so-called developed world, we're seeing a huge rise in inequality, with the UK being the second most unequal country in the world after the US. The philosophy that if you give more to the rich, the wealth will trickle down to the poor still pertains in the UK in its current state. Yet one of the world's leading economists, Joseph Stiglitz, states that such a market fundamentalist ideology serves the interests at the top, often at the expense of the rest of society. And so to combat all this, we need a true solidarity where there is neither a you nor me, but only an us. That means trying to put yourself in the shoes of the poor and look beyond the media concentration of how the poor of Africa or Asia or even Scotland require our help as white saviours regarding their situation, to moving to a view which is more honestly connected to the type of world that we have created. It's one of greed and unfairness, one which puts the market before people and ideologies, a la Thatcher and Johnson, before the people's well-being. Instead, we need to create a new place which says yes to life and all creation in its fullness, that tells the truth instead of lies, that gives meaning to being human, that puts dignity before greed, and that proclaims hope, especially to the poor and excluded, and promotes peace by getting rid of nuclear weapons away from our largest centre of population and our country. Then I believe we'll be on the road to creating a more just and truly liberated Scotland. Faith has much to offer that, and I leave the last word to Pope Francis. I think you can guess I'm a fan. The Pope suggests that the other Brucket Bairn, the Church, as people of God and institution, should be, quote, a place of mercy freely given, where everyone can be welcomed, loved, forgiven, and encouraged to live the good life of the gospel. And if we can't interest people in the gospel, we can at least ensure that the ethical concepts contained in Jesus' messages and liberation theology form the basis of that new Scotland which we will forge. Thank you very much.